Hello there, I'm Chuck Todd, and welcome to another episode of Meet the Press Reports, where each week we take one issue and dive deep into it. This week, it's evangelicals. When Donald Trump announced his presidential campaign in 2015, a big reason campaign strategists at the time doubted he could actually win the nomination was that they did not see how an adulterous, twice divorced, casino-owning reality TV star could win over the most conservative part of the Republican Party's base, white evangelicals. But from the beginning, Trump got strong support from these values voters and easily cleared the field. He went on to win 77% of the evangelical vote in 2016, and he did even better 4 years later, winning 84% against Joe Biden. It was clear then that evangelical support for Donald Trump was not an aberration, but an affirmation. There are many evangelicals who want to move on from Donald Trump, those that are concerned that the devotional has taken a backseat to the political, and that the very term evangelical has lost its religious meaning altogether. But they are in the minority. In some churches now, it's commonplace to hear anti-mask tirades and vaccine disinformation. Nearly half of pastors have reported hearing parishioners repeating conspiracy theories. And 3 in 5 white evangelicals believe the 2020 election was somehow stolen from Donald Trump. Our own Ann Thompson went to Tennessee recently to see how one city is figuring out what it means to be an evangelical today.
Under this flag-painted roof, religion and politics mix.
I want Trump to come back sooner than later. But you know who would be a lot better than Trump coming back? Jesus coming back.
With gusto.
Biden, you trouble Israel. Leftists, you trouble Israel.
This is the Patriot Church on the outskirts of Knoxville, Tennessee.
You unvaccinated people. You are causing the trouble in the land. That's what they say.
Founded by Pastor Ken Peters.
This nation was founded on predominantly Christian values by predominantly Christian people. We just want to keep that in play. We just want to keep our roots alive and not let this reconstruction, this tearing up of our nation's roots and a new set of values is being pushed on us. It literally is.
So whose values are being pushed on you?
These are leftist, worldly values. They can't stand Christian culture. Why? Because we believe marriage is between a man and a woman. We believe that there are only 2 genders. We believe that life in the womb is actually human life, and they're murdering human life for money.
He's not afraid to take sides and thinks God does too.
One thing I've learned about Scripture and the Lord is God can use anybody. In the Bible, he even used a donkey. And if God can use a donkey, he can use President Trump.
Do you think God is using President Trump?
Absolutely. I think President Trump is a miracle. I think God picked Donald Trump, an imperfect vessel, to be the champion of his people.
That intertwining of patriotism, politics, and religion is attracting a devoted following.
When you're in a culture where everybody's trying to silence you, it's great to be able to share how you really feel with people who feel the same way.
We're just checking it out. Actually saw it on CNN, and if they say something bad about it, it might be good.
Peters leading one side of the battle for the soul of the evangelical church.
Some of the evangelical church, I think, is soft. I think they're cowardly, and they're trying to ride the fence between the left and the right. And so that's kind of where the divide is.
Here in the heart of the Bible Belt.
I would say, as a person of faith who's been around church all my life, that the Bible Belt is unbuckling.
Across town, Pastor Phil Nordstrom leads the Life Church.
What do you mean that the Bible Belt is unbuckling?
The branding of Christianity has suffered. I think that our association with political extremism has especially turned off a younger generation toward evangelicalism. So one of the challenges we face right now is, who are we? What does it mean to be an evangelical?
Nordstrom is decidedly old school, a pro-life pastor pointedly staying away from partisan politics on Sunday.
The funny thing is, I'm probably personally pretty conservative, so I don't come across as like I'm a liberal evangelical, but people get the spirit, get the feeling pretty quick that we're a pretty inclusive church, that everyone's welcome, that we're trying to not fight the culture wars from the pulpit.
Nordstrom builds his church with passengers he meets driving for Uber and Lyft.
You have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
All right, appreciate you.
Under his soft-spoken demeanor, a growing anger that the things he loves are misconstrued.
I think the easy thing to do would be to say, I'm no longer an evangelical. Or like, I'm no longer a patriot. No, I'm a patriot. And I'm an evangelical. And I'm proud of it. I still believe in a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, which is what an evangelical, in my view, is.
A view shared by his men's group.
Amen. All right.
Meeting for Saturday morning Bible study.
We're Christians because we follow Christ, and not because we're Americans, and our faith isn't in the political system.
Nor is Nordstrom's in the former president.
A lot of pastors have the approach of, I'll just put it just bluntly, hold your nose and vote for Trump. In other words, we're not really totally on board with his attitude, spirit, but if you give us those kind of policies, we'll put up with almost anything, if that makes sense.
Does that make sense to you?
It does not make sense to me. And the reason it doesn't make sense to me is because the end doesn't justify the means.
Two men of faith with different ways of serving God. Peters marched to the Capitol on January 6th. Nordstrom marched with Black Lives Matter. Peters wraps himself in red, white, and blue. Nordstrom doesn't have a flag inside his church. Peters gives voting instructions from his pulpit. Nordstrom thinks voting is a private matter. Evangelicals first became a political force in 1976. Their candidate then, the born-again Baptist, Democrat Jimmy Carter.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
4 years later, Jerry Falwell's moral majority led evangelicals to the Republican Party and helped deliver to Ronald Reagan a 44-state election victory.
Evangelical fundamentalist churches follow the cue of their pastor.
Efforts soon augmented by the Christian Coalition.
Today, many of the people that would have been part of the Christian Coalition are just in the Republican Party.
University of Notre Dame professor David Campbell writes about religion and politics.
How did we go from Jimmy Carter to patriot churches?
It's not like many Americans didn't already think of themselves as evangelicals before Jimmy Carter. They did. They had just never connected it to politics. So you could sort of think of Jimmy Carter's campaign in 1976, where he made much of his evangelical bona fides, as essentially opening a Pandora's box for American politics that has brought us to the current state where evangelicals are not just a religious movement, but a very powerful political movement.
At the Patriot Church, Peters preaches from the gospel of the Republican right wing, railing against vaccine mandates.
If I don't want to shove that in my body, why should I have to?
Insisting the election was stolen.
Of course, they don't care about the Dominion machines.
And that religious freedom is under attack.
It's freedom of religion, not freedom from religion.
In the patriot movement, do you have to win all these battles, or is there room for compromise?
There's definitely room for compromise. Like I said, we believe as Christians that everyone should be free. So within the realm of freedom, yes, there is compromise.
Is there a compromise on gay marriage that's possible?
Absolutely. I would say civil unions.
And what's the compromise on immigration?
Yeah, legal immigration.
What about on the issue of abortion services? Is there a compromise there?
No.
Not
should not murder human life.
But even at Liberty University, founded by Jerry Falwell, there are fissures over faith and partisanship, centered on its political think tank, the Standing for Freedom Center. Student Matt Morris gathered 1,000 signatures from the Liberty community, demanding the center shut down.
I think the signers of the petition are sick of being told that Christianity needs to look a certain way in politics, or that it needs to be engaged in politics.
The center's social media manager, Christian Losval, says it is following Falwell Sr.'s vision of evangelicals participating in the public square.
Those are not political issues. Those are God issues that have been made political. We have a moral obligation as believers to do what we can with what we've been given in this country to preserve and protect what God has deemed to be good.
Some take it a step further to American exceptionalism, says author and historian Kristen Dumais.
We see these broader trends throughout mainstream evangelicalism itself. This embrace of patriotism, this commitment to Christian nationalism.
How close is Christian nationalism to white nationalism?
It is close in many ways because Christian nationalism holds up this mythical understanding of America as God's chosen nation, and it really does whitewash the troubled history of racism in America. So it's not a huge step in many cases from ardent Christian nationalists to white nationalism.
An association Pastor Peters vehemently disputes.
Oh, there are wonderful Christian black folk and Asian and Hispanic. Christianity is for the whole world. It's for every race. It's for every tribe, every tongue. So no, it has nothing to do with white at all. I don't even understand how that could be considered that sort of thing. I don't even get it.
But people make that connection.
I guess. I don't make that connection at all.
Trying to strengthen the connection between God and country, yet dividing a faith and a nation.
So what is the future of the evangelical movement? Joining me now to discuss is my colleague Ann Thompson, who you just heard there, Eddie Glaude Jr. He's chair of the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University, and David French is a senior editor of the Dispatch. And look, anytime you go into a reporting assignment, you have an idea of what you're going to find, but you're surprised by some things. What surprised you the most on this assignment?
I think when I ask people at the Patriot Church why they attended that church, I've been covering religion for truly decades now, Chuck. And usually when you talk to people about going to church, they speak about God. They speak about seeking spiritual nourishment. I didn't hear any of that at the Patriot Church. These are people who go to that church because there are like-minded people who think like them on issues of abortion, on issues of same-sex marriage. They are also all people who are very worried about the U.S. Constitution and that it is being somehow harmed, and the very fabric of this country is being harmed by what's happening in the world today.
David French, you live in Tennessee. She captured this well?
I'll tell you, there are two things that were captured particularly well here. One is from the Patriot Church pastor. And Patriot churches there's not many Patriot churches out there, but he said something that a lot of people say, and it was this, that God had this specific purpose for Donald Trump, that he had this sort of kind of special calling. And this is something you're going to hear a lot, particularly in Pentecostal churches, that it's not just that sort of God and his sovereignty, God and his sovereignty permitted Trump to be president the way he does all presidents, but that there was something special about Trump. So that was number one. And then the other thing that was really important was the other pastor she highlighted, how he was befuddled. Befuddled may not be the right word, but kind of taken aback at the idea that his leaving of politics would in any way imply that he was some sort of squished theologically, because that's what a lot of people imply, is that if you don't support Donald Trump, then you don't believe the Bible. There's something wrong with you theologically. And for a lot of us, like myself and Russell Moore and some other people who are evangelical, we are theologically orthodox, it's been incredibly disorienting to see that our opposition for Trump was sort of taken as a sign of spiritual backsliding.
Eddie, the phrase that I can't stop thinking about is the Bible Belt is unbuckling, right? It was a very, I think, it was a pretty sticky quote, because you see what he's saying. The thing that I take away is where's the Christianity? That seems to be what's missing.
Right. It seems as if the adjective is over-determining the noun, white evangelical, right? And let me just say this up front. I'm the former president of the American Academy of Religion, the largest body of scholars of religion in the world. So this is in my wheelhouse, Chuck. And part of what we have to do is to kind of understand the historical backdrop to this. What I was hearing from Pastor Peters in Knoxville sounded really familiar. It was the language of Paul Weyrich, of the, what it was, the organization Free Congress Foundation. It was the language of those who responded to the secularization of American culture coming out of the 60s and 70s, responding to desegregation, responding to the women's rights movement, responding to the gay rights movement. LGBT. So what we're seeing in Donald Trump is in some ways the culmination of 50 years of organizing. And although Trump was a broken vessel, he's a Christian in progress. He is, in fact, if we read him correctly, it seems to me, an outcome of organizing that we have seen in the country among white evangelical Christians on the right for at least 4 or 5 decades, Trump.
Ann, one of the things, I have a podcast with Kristen Dumais, who wrote Jesus and John Wayne, and one of the things she noted is how many Christian denominations feel as if what's happening in the evangelical movement is staining all Christianity a bit. Have you found this?
I think what's happening in the evangelical movement, you could say the same thing is happening in the Catholic Church in many ways. It is the left versus right, and it all starts from the issue of abortion and goes from there. But, the thing that I was really struck by in talking to Pastor Peters is why he started the Patriot Church outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. He said it was because of people's political beliefs there. He knew they would have a home there. So now there is a Patriot Church in Knoxville, in Lynchburg, Virginia, home of Liberty University, 2 out in Washington State where he's from, and he's got 2 more on the drawing board. It will be interesting to see just how far this movement goes.
Are we ever going to see I was raised by parents who said, hey, the 2 things you don't discuss are religion and politics. So, of course, that's what I do for a living these days. But, David, is this part of the politicizing of everything movement? Is this what's happened to evangelicals, or is it deeper than that?
Oh, it's a part of politicizing of everything and also turning politics into religion. There's some really interesting research that shows that people who describe themselves as evangelical, more than half of them go to church once a month or less. Okay, so in many ways, evangelicalism is becoming a God and country lifestyle brand for some folks. There's even research that shows that 2/3 of Republican Protestants who are 2/3 of Republican Protestants who go to church only yearly call themselves evangelicals. So evangelical has become such a religious marker, a political marker, that people who even have a casual connection to religion, so long as they're Republicans, so long as they're white Republicans, are calling themselves evangelical. And that's a big part of this movement that a lot of evangelical leaders don't like to recognize. They like to say that, oh, look, we're all these church-going folks who've decided on Donald Trump. Not as much as they might lead you to believe.
Eddie, is this do we even fight to keep religion out of politics? I could argue the best thing for all religious movements would be to separate from politics. That's not the history of our country, but would it be healthier?
I don't think so. That would become the occasion for people to act in bad faith, right? The late philosopher Richard Rorty would say that religion was by definition a conversation stopper. I don't think that's true. I think we want people to act in good faith. These are my commitments. This is why I hold this particular position, and I want to argue for it in the public domain. So banning it doesn't make much sense to me.
Well, it's a conversation that is always awkward to have, religion and politics, but these days it's an important one to have, and you guys are thoughtful people to have that discussion. Ann Thompson, terrific reporting. David French and Eddie Glaude Jr., you guys always add so much to the conversation. Thank you both. Coming up, I sat down, you've heard his name invoked a few times here, Russell Moore. Well, I sat down with Russell Moore on where the evangelical movement is right now and where it's headed.
10 years ago, I was having parents come to me and say, I'm worried about my children, they're losing the faith. Now I'm having children coming to me and saying, I'm worried about my parents.
Welcome back. From 2013 until this past summer, Dr. Russell Moore was the president of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. It's the policy arm of the Southern Baptist Convention. Dr. Moore also was one of the highest profile conservative evangelical opponents of Donald Trump. He is now the public theologian at Christianity Today. I spoke with Dr. Moore earlier and began by asking him about a phrase he often uses, the secularization of evangelicalism.
The use of religion as a means to an end, for an end of politics, for various sorts of ends that really can transform and change the nature of Christianity itself. So if you look at, for instance, some of the tactics often used by people who are claiming to be evangelical Christians, they're often quite short of the Sermon on the Mount.
What's fascinating is that if you look at some of the Pew studies, more people are identifying as white evangelical, and yet fewer people are going to church. It is
right.
It is not as if these people are finding religion in the sense of what that phrase would have meant just a decade ago. What is happening here?
Well, that's what concerns me. I'm talking every day to church-going evangelical Christians who don't want to use the word evangelical because it's become merely a political word. And then those who don't go to church but who are using evangelical in a political sense as a way to own the libs. That's not a good development in my view. Once evangelical Christianity is defined not by the gospel, but by some sort of cultural or political movement, we're in a really dangerous place. Evangelical Christianity is meant to be the good news of Jesus Christ, and handing that over to a political agenda, no matter what the political agenda, is a bad idea. And that's especially true when we're in this crisis moment where the moral credibility of virtually every institution is being challenged, and the church is certainly no exception.
You know, it's interesting. David French, I want to use this phrase correctly. He calls these unchurched evangelicals, he says they're helping to create a God and country lifestyle brand, but it seems totally separated from a values approach to living a God-fearing life.
Yes, and I think that's the end result of having so many evangelical leaders say, character doesn't matter, winning matters, diminishing the role of theology and moral formation and highlighting the role of evangelicalism as a voting bloc. I think when people see that, they start to emulate the characteristics of their leaders. And I mean, we have seen evangelical leaders speaking in terms that would have been incomprehensible in the Bill Clinton era. And I think that's having an effect. And so often what I'm doing is spending all day talking faithful evangelical young people out of walking away from the church, at the same time that you have people who haven't been in a church since Vacation Bible School, but think they're evangelicals because of their political beliefs.
You know, it's interesting. I have family acquaintances who will push back and say, well, you know, it's because of Bill Clinton that I decided that I should accept Donald Trump. How much is that connected?
Well, I think that there's a reasonable argument that many of my fellow evangelical Christians made and make, that they were voting for the lesser of two evils, that they were voting for Supreme Court appointments, and that they weren't voting for the rest of it. And in the cases where there are people who did that and then wanted to hold the president accountable for his moral failings in other areas, that's reasonable enough. It's not my view, but it's a reasonable view. The problem is when we get into this idea that whatever the tactics of the quote-unquote other side is, should be the tactics that we adopt. I think that's a really social Darwinian form of thinking about how we engage with our neighbors. And I think we ought to have a distinctive witness, one that's characterized by something quite different from all that.
When you hear that the former president told a Christian broadcast, he went on television and told them that he did more for Christianity or for evangelicals or for religion itself, that nobody else had done more. What do you think when you hear him say this?
You know, I think that's the tragic part about the past several years. If I had heard that in 2015 or 2016 or 2017 even, I think I would have been outraged all day. I would have flinched immediately when hearing it. I wasn't really even surprised. I think I gave it a half-second's thought and moved on, because we have so many things like that being said that we've become used to it. And I think that's part of the problem right now, the coarsening and the trivialization of rhetoric in American life. We're getting used to it, and that's dangerous.
Christian nationalism. When you hear that phrase, it strikes fear into some people when they hear it. But that seems to be a growing movement within the movement. What do you make of it?
Well, I'm not sure that Christian nationalism is a helpful term, just because I have heard it used correctly about people who want to use God as a totem for kind of a white identity politics. I've also heard people use Christian nationalism to describe Christians who simply are engaged in the civic arena. That's not an appropriate use of the term. And frankly, I'm very concerned about the rise of Christian nationalism, not just in the United States, but in Europe, in Latin America, and elsewhere. And so people who were worried that somehow George W. Bush was leading a theocratic takeover actually are part of the problem here, because when we actually do have a serious issue emerging around the world, it seems as though we're immune to it.
The word evangelical.
Because, obviously,
do you no longer want to be described?
Engagement.
Do you no longer want to be described as an evangelical? Has the word been distorted?
You know, in the middle of 2016, I stopped calling myself evangelical for about a month. And I found that I couldn't find a replacement for it to describe what it means to be a gospel-centered Christian, Protestant Christian, who believes in the things that we believe. Now I just find I have to explain it to people. It was meant to be a shorthand. The shorthand doesn't work when we have to add several sentences to explain it, but I haven't found an alternative.
Dr. Russell Moore, this is exactly the conversation I hope we could have. You've brought a lot of thought and heart to this. Thank you for coming on and sharing your perspective with us.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all we have for Meet the Press Reports this week. Next week, we're going to take a look at a topic that is animating school boards all across the country. It's the fight over how race is taught in public schools. I'll see you next week right here on Peacock and this Sunday on Meet the Press.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.